Okay, hello everyone. My name is Dawn Dole and I'm the Executive Director for the Taos Institute. Welcome to this dialogue with the author today. We are featuring in this dialogue the new book by Sage Publishing. And today we're going to be talking about constructionist practices related to community practices. So we're really excited about this dialogue with the author today. We've got several authors of that section with us and the editor of that section. But before we jump into that, I wanted to just give you a little background on the Taos Institute if you're new to the Institute. The Taos Institute mission is to bring together scholars and practitioners concerned with the social processes essential for construction of reason, knowledge, and human value, and their application in relational, collaborative, and appreciative practices around the world. We're a global nonprofit virtual organization. We don't have a building or a physical space. And constructionist theory and practice locates the source of meaning, value, and action in the relational connection among people. And it is through this relational process that we create the world in which we most want to live and work. And our focus is on how social groups and the relational practices within those groups create and sustain beliefs in the real, the rational, and the good. And the Taos Institute offers programs such as International Diploma Program, workshops both in person and online, conferences, books, and these dialogue with the author programs and much more. So we invite you to visit our website for lots and lots of resources. Many of them are free, and also to learn more about social construction. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Marie Hoskins, who is the editor for this section. And Marie, you are on.
Hey, thank you, Dawn, and thanks for introducing the audience to the Taos Institute. So I'm Marie Hoskins. I am the section editor for the final section of the handbook on community practices from a social constructionist perspective. I'm speaking to you today from sunny Victoria, British Columbia, Canada, and I want to acknowledge the privilege and luxury of working and living on the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish peoples. It's a real honor to be invited into this, this community. So the agenda, Dawn, do you have that in front of you? That slide. Dawn, are you there? No. Okay, so I just wanted to do a run through of how we're going to proceed for the next hour and a half. So next slide, Dawn. Just, yeah. All right, so we're going to start with, whoops, this has changed a bit. we're going to actually begin with Celiane and Cesar. And David Hooker are going to have do some presentation of their work. And then we're going to follow that. I'm sorry, this agenda has changed a little bit. Anyway.
Yeah, we changed it in the last minute, so I didn't get the slide changed. So they're going to go second or third.
Yes, but what we're going to do is have the different authors present for about 5 minutes, present their work, and then have a dialogue with each other. So you'll get to listen in on how they're thinking about each other's work. So that's great. Thanks, Dawn. All right, we can take that off now. Great. So I apologize for reading, but I just want to make sure that I orient everyone to the sort of overarching themes that kept all chapters in line, and there's lovely connections. So I apologize for reading that. So at its very core, sustainable community development is grounded in the belief that all people should have access to health, well-being, wealth, justice, and opportunity. Needless to say, these macro level goals for humanity are not achieved easily, yet they underlie many community development and community building projects throughout the world. They have also been the ultimate goals of all of the chapters in this section, and have been achieved in various ways and in a variety of contexts. You'll hear about those shortly. Despite the wide range of approaches used, the author's processes for achieving such goals have one important ethic in common. When engaging in community development projects, they have all made concerted efforts to include the voices of those who have the most at stake, the community members themselves. From a social constructionist perspective, this means that at the heart of everything that is done when it comes to any interventions is the critical question: what's really at stake and for whom? Involving citizens for the authors of this section has meant that community members are invited, not mandated, to participate at all levels. Without a commitment from the participants, as many of the authors point out, small changes can be made, but significant and enduring transformation is highly unlikely. Even when working with individuals, as you'll hear from John Winslade shortly, it's pointed out in their chapter, people need to first of all be willing and committed to engage in a change process before any steps towards mediation can occur. And change, the authors argue, is a community endeavor in that conflict, even when it's seemingly only between individuals, ripples out to affect others. Collaborations at many levels are necessary if sustainable changes are to happen. None of the authors included in this section endorsed hierarchical, top-down approaches. Not only are dialogue and collaboration central to social constructionist approaches, but during the last decade, the World Health Organization has repeatedly stated that community engagement is pivotal in achieving positive outcomes for communities when trying to promote peace, democracy, dialogue, and participation. Rather than an expert-driven approach, often used in some traditional community development projects, community engagement is assumed to be the best way for all of these health-promoting goals. Without citizen participation, it's argued by many, community developers tend to have short-term or limited success. Not surprisingly, the language and related practices found in many current community engagement publications align well with social constructionist ideas and ideals. Shortly, you will hear how social constructionist perspectives have been used to strengthen and extend community practices in various parts of the world. So each author in this section has demonstrated a way of working that weaves their community practice experiences with compatible social constructionist theories. Some authors began their work by being immersed in these ideas and ideals, while others turned to theory when encountering certain impasses in their community projects. As mentioned above, but worth repeating, what they have in common is their desire to avoid a hierarchical approach that positions community development experts as all-knowing consultants who are parachuted in to solve a community's problems. In addition to a commitment to dialogue and collaboration, emergence and humility are central to many of the projects you're going to hear about. Many authors describe their underlying principles, but refrain from offering prescriptive steps for achieving success. How to proceed as a community emerges from the dialogue itself, and more importantly, the relationships formed. It is a humble approach that avoids making sweeping generalizations. But alongside, and I've just got a few more minutes here, but alongside the embodiment of these core values mentioned above, there's a growing recognition that there is also something else going on, something critical, in fact. Recognition of power, equity, and social justice also run through these chapters. For example, some authors mention the challenge of working in communities where there are glaring economic differences. One might ask, is it possible to truly engage in generative dialogues when some people live in abject poverty and others are so privileged? One author argues that until living conditions are improved for a marginalized segment of the population, it's difficult, if not impossible, to genuinely forgive past wrongs committed by those in positions of power and influence. Other authors point out that not only are there economic disparities needing to be reconciled, but there are also challenges related to the issue of land ownership. Rights, responsibilities, and land ownership often collide when identity politics are alive and not so well. Okay, I'm going to move along. So I just want to mention that Sheila and Ken's book, written in 1999, Relational Responsibility, also raises the point related to difference and how appreciation is perhaps a preferable term when thinking of responding to the other. And subsequently, Ken Gergen also reminds us in several of his writings and workshops that we need to remember that whenever we divide the world into good versus evil, we are not necessarily perceived as being on the side of the good, and may in fact be someone else's evil. Perhaps more than ever in our global world, this rings true. Differences, deep divides, and polarities become particularly salient throughout the chapters in this section, and authors have made concerted efforts to address them in their work. And I want to end this introduction. Dawn, do you have the slide of Mary? Mary Gergen unfortunately passed away not too long ago, but was instrumental in helping this book come alive. So now I can't quite see my ending here. Just 1 second, sorry. So I want to appreciate her because for me, she was the ultimate community builder. Many of us would not be here if it wasn't for her remarkable generosity of spirit, her warmth, and her kindness. She welcomed us into her home and into her heart, and I am forever grateful to her. All right, that's the end of my introduction. So pretty soon we are going to see, I think we're hearing from Eileen first, Dawn, if that's correct. We've rejigged the agenda here.
Actually, we're inviting John Winslade in. So I'm going to bring John into this. Ask to start video. So John's video's not on. John, can you turn your video on? And I'm going to bring you in.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but I don't see your video on.
Okay. I'm just doing this on a phone and I don't
okay, we can come back to
see my
you.
picture.
Let's come back to you. Let's bring in
Okay.
Eileen now for her presentation, and then we'll bring in Kristen and Peter to be in dialogue with Eileen. So Eileen, let me get you here. Okay, so we should be seeing Eileen now. And Marie, I'm gonna remove you and bring you in a few minutes when we're ready for John. Okay.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for Marie for that beautiful introduction, and how honored I am to be a part of this collection, and also want to acknowledge Mary. Mary has been, as for many of us, she was very consequential in for me as a thinking partner in various stages of my work. And my chapter talks about how we know ourselves in the stories of us. And here I also want to acknowledge how Sheila and Ken's relational responsibility has just been a thread through all my work always. So in this chapter, which I collaborated with Erin Taylor, we talk about how we expand and deepen our stories of ourselves in relationship with those who are different from us. That no matter how we know ourselves, that engagement and fully deep engagement with others who are different from us in significant ways helps us to expand, affirm, and perhaps transform the ways that we know ourselves. And the chapter that we've written is based on both research and praxis in doing work with organizations around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So what I want to say at the outset is that the last year plus in the United States has seen an expansion, in some ways an explosion of organizations saying that they're committed to doing this work, and a lot of new practitioners coming to the field. And this is where I just want to say how important I think social construction theory and the contributions of the authors to this collection are so critical in really treating this work with precious intention. And so, and that means recognizing the complexity of this. So we used social construction theory and the coordinated management of meaning, a communication theory based in social constructionist perspective, to understand how the very narratives that potentially foster connections and affiliations among people may also be the very same narratives that create walls of misunderstanding. And that the social constructionist approach invites us to see our way of knowing as one way of knowing, and to maintain a curious stance to other possibilities, as well as to knowing how we know. Because until we step back and observe our stories in relationship with others, we may not have even noticed our own stories, no less how they live side by side with others. So further, the principles and tools of the coordinated management of meaning, CMM, support the capacity to relate with alacrity and agility, moving back and forth from being in one's experience, being in the conversation, to observing oneself, not the self, but the space between, the space of the relationship, and to look at what are we doing and what are we making and how do we make it better. So in part, that is enabled by looking at what is my hope for this moment. Am I hoping for collaboration and deepening and understanding? And is that in coordination with what's happening in this episode that we're creating together? Because sometimes what the desire may be for meaningful deepening connection, and what is showing up as identity threat, and that is also construed in the process of relating. And so in the discourse of diversity, equity, and inclusion, we have the tension of looking at a frame of understanding one's experience and the communities that people have held as their narratives of their life. And so we talk about diversity as being an equity and inclusion initiatives, as being the opportunity for learning and developing. And that in the literature is a progression from looking at it in the United States lens as equal opportunities and affirmative action, which is very much looking at identities oftentimes in a very simplistic way, rather than looking at identities from the multitude of intersectionality and the uniqueness of story. Dawn, how much time do I have?
It is time to switch over to Kristen and Peter, if that's a good place for you to pause.
I would just like to just add one more thing as a way of rounding this out, which is that there are enabling conditions that foster the curious relationship. Marie, you talked about dialogue and continuous open-ended conversations, and encouraging the imagination of what it is that we are wanting to create together in an affirmative kind of way. So we, in our practice, have built on the strength of positive organizational scholarship and appreciative inquiry, in looking at the invitation of the encounter as not just understanding, but the invitation to be noticing, not understanding, noticing the mystery, and keeping the openness present. Thank you.
Okay, Kristen and Peter.
Yeah. Eileen, first of all, just thank you so much for kicking off this conversation, because I'm so curious to continue in dialogue with you. And I think we can talk more about these enabling conditions in conversation. So thank you. And I just was really struck too about the statement you made, notice our own stories and how they live side by side with another, really making that invisible visible. And I like to just offer our chapter as kind of another resource to build on what you were saying, Eileen. And our, hi, Peter. I see you're doing homeschooling or grandparents raising grandchildren activity here, intergenerational activity here. Hi, Kathy. So we're just really delighted to be here, and thank you, Marie, for guiding us through our kind of unconventional chapter, as Peter and I always like to be a little unconventional. And we are offering this concept of intergenerativity as one of those enabling conditions, hopefully, Eileen, a resource, a relational resource for us to bring differences together to really expound the possibilities. And so Peter, I'd first like to just ask Peter, because Peter, as you all know, likes to create words. And intergenerativity has really grown from the work at the intergenerational schools. And so Peter, can I ask you to just share, what does intergenerativity mean to you? Oops, we can't hear you. It doesn't look like you're on mute. So maybe just checking the voice settings, maybe. There you go. I think we can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, good. We can hear you, Peter, now.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Mm-hmm. Yep. You might not be able to hear us now, but we can hear you.
Maybe take your headset out, Peter, just for a couple
I don't
minutes.
think he can hear us, Don. Do you want to text?
Hello, hello?
We can hear you.
Okay, so I'm sitting on a toilet in an assisted living facility where I'm taking a break from moving my in-laws into assisted living, an intergenerational moment. But let me talk about intergenerativity. I was kicked out of the bedroom because they're putting a bed in. So Kristen, great to be with you and everybody. I think words are important. And of course, they're most important when they're embedded in stories. And as some of you know, and as Kristen mentioned, as many of you, my wife and I have been committed to intergenerational conversations. I think to Eileen's point, and I want to emphasize the word diversity, we are going to be more creative at co-constructing narratives that are helpful to help the new civilization we all want to merge if we have a diversity of voices in these stories. So intergenerativity emerged as a response to taking the word intergenerational and taking the word generativity and saying our stories and our conversations need to bring sources of creativity from many different sources, not just people of different age. And I'll say two things. The whole school produced a movie celebrating concepts like love and respect and diversity that are behind intergenerativity that's on YouTube. Although it first emerged as a word in the World Appreciative Inquiry Conference in Nepal in 2009 and was expanded when I was trekking in Nepal. So this is a word that for me has a rich source of narratives that converge, I think. And we look forward to your ideas about it. I hope that was what you wanted, and I apologize for being in transition to the bathroom on the way when you asked me the question.
Thank you so much, Peter. And I popped the definition as we've been developing it into chat so people can read, which is the basis for our chapter. And I know we're really tight on time and we want to get into conversation with Eileen. So I just wanted to share, Peter and I wanted to share 3 points that we made in our chapter that will transition to this conversation with Eileen. And this is where Marie was very, and Sage was very generous with allowing us to do our unconventional. We really presented our ideas as a dialogue. We thought that it was really important for us to continue to be in dialogue as we're shaping our understanding of what intergenerativity means and how it can be a resource for us in the world. And then we use storytelling in order to focus on what's being done and making existing resources and progress more visible. And so you'll see that we invited others from around the world to share inspiring stories throughout the chapter. We hope that the resources that help make those enabling conditions available are very visible in these stories and these narratives that people share. And in the spirit of being able to move into dialogue with Eileen, let's go ahead and open it up. And we'd also like to invite everyone who is on this call. What's really important to Peter and I and others is just that we continue to expand the dialogue. So as you have a chance to read this chapter, as you think about this concept of intergenerativity, we'd love for you to share your own stories. How has this resource of bringing differences together as a resource for more generative possibilities, what's enabled that? What's been important? What were the resources that you used? And through all of our stories, what can we learn? So to transition over, Eileen, I'm so excited to be in conversation with you about this. Can you continue where you left off a little bit? What are you learning about the enabling conditions that help us do this work well, about navigating and really not just navigating, but understanding all of our differences, our complex differences as resources for creating more equitable, thriving societies? Tell us more. I want to learn.
Thank you so much. And Kristen and Peter, one of the enabling conditions I think of right away is having the language that invites us to imagine. And I am really going to be enjoying playing, continue to enjoy playing with your language of intergenerativity. When I think about enabling conditions, some of them seem so basic and simple, like taking the time. All too often when we're engaging differences, we want to come to closure, we want to come to a simple script, and we want to make sure we don't make any mistakes. And those three things I would offer a reverse frame for is recognizing that we need to throw out whatever script, or suspend, more adequately stated, is to notice the scripts that we try to conform to and suspend those scripts in exploration of other possibilities. To recognize when we're trying to rush to get it right, and to recognize that rather than be about getting it, whatever it is, right, look at honoring the relationship so that there's grace for learning together. Those are the things that pop out, but time is so critical, and what we need to do is make time for each other.
Yeah, thank you for that so much. And I'm going to be really interested too to see how David Anderson Hooker's work relates to that of taking time and really honoring the relationship. So I'm excited to see how this threads. I see Peter's connecting to audio again. So Eileen, I'm wondering if you can share a story for us that illustrates this concept of intergenerativity in your work. Do you have anything where there's a fusion of different sources of creativity that have come together to create something new?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I offer a composite story in the chapter. But one of the things I would say is that when I have been, or we as a consulting group have been invited in to do training, our response is that we do conversations rather than training. And again, as we look at language and what does language do, that shifts from there's something to know and there's a truth to convey that will have us doing this correctly, to there are relationships to build. And one of the projects that I've that I reference here is having been asked to do training for police when there was an incident in a community that was racially charged. And when we spoke to the potential client that became a client and said, we'd like to do conversations rather than training. Part of what we learned is the structure of the relationship of the police and the community. And the structure was hierarchical and one down and marginal. And so by conducting conversations, we not only were able to bring police in as full partners with corporate members, with educators, with community members. In the process, there were stories that we had learned about appreciation of moments with the police, where an encounter which could have turned one way, turned another way with a teenager. Mm. And we were able to, because we heard the story and we surmised which police officers were involved, we were able in live action to introduce them to each other. And if I can tell you that in this break time, in this moment, there wasn't a dry eye. So that's an example of police and community. Another example is in a nursing home where there was hostility between dietary and the lowest level of nursing. And it was framed as racial, where complexity offered a view of positionality and where they were in the relationship. And so a simple situation that looked like dietary was prescribing food carefully to a patient, to a resident, and the nurses were eating that food, therefore disrupting the balance. When stories unfolded, they learned that the nurses had tried to feed the client. It was and was spit at, and there were other alternatives that needed to be explored. And an extra bag of potato chips at midnight was available. So the ways in which misunderstandings disrupt relationships and attributions are made quickly to such identities as race or position. And the stories, I offer that as a story because it was so far more complex than that. And the expanding of the stories deepened the relationships.
Thank you, Eileen. And I see Lois, you have a question. So let's get to that. But I have a question for Peter before we talk about, and I don't know, Don, how much more time we have, about creating the environment for stories to be shared. I have so many questions. I have another question for Eileen at some point, like, how do you create a bridge from the language of expectations of training to conversations? I think it's important for us that are working with constructionist ideas of how do we bridge these ideas to practice. But Peter, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, please. I switched to the phone, by the way.
Okay. One thing, Eileen, that you said was that really the disruption in the relationship offers us an opportunity to slow down and kind of bring this idea of complexity in to better understand what's happening in these moments. And I know, Peter, part of your passion is us thinking about what's happening in society and nature and in the world right now. How do we think of this time of these great disruptions with climate and our environment to slow down and look at the complexity of that disruption? What are your thoughts?
So thank you for mentioning one of my passions, and I'm sure many of us on the call, I know you, Kristen, this idea that we have got to, oh, good grief, an incoming call. When it rains, it pours. When we are in nature, and quite literally, I'm taking leadership of the intergenerational school to the Arboretum. Many of you know that I have a particular passion for trees, for a fundraising event, because I do think when you're in a space of majesty and awe and mystery, I think Eileen mentioned some of the importance of this, the idea that you can tell different stories that affect time. Because we are in a society where we barely have time to think or do anything other than just, take care of the next call on our cell phone. So, yeah, I think intergenerational storytelling in nature promotes a sense of possibility about relationship and relationships over time that are so important. We have got to stop thinking about the next quarter and the next semester. We have got to think about our responsibilities for an emerging future. Thank you, Kristen.
Eileen, I think we have about 1 minute left. Do you have anything you want to ask of Peter and me?
Peter, I'm just I'm captivated by the image of intergenerativity in nature and expanding time in the context of awe. And I am so curious to take time out in a parallel walk and explore those concepts more deeply. I'm aware of time, Kristen. You're doing an awesome job with that. As some know, I unfortunately will be moving to the phone in about 10 minutes. So I'm going to turn it back to you, Kristen.
Great, thank you so much. We're going to move on to John Winslade. So I've got Marie and John coming on the screen. Thank you so much, Kristen, Peter, and Eileen.
Greetings.
There you go.
I would like to start by with a Maori greeting, because I'm in New Zealand at the moment. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. E nā iwi, e nā mana, e nā reo. Tēnā koutou. That is, for those that don't understand Maori, which is most of the population of the that are here on this call. What I said was greetings, 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 and greetings 3 times in case you didn't get it the first time. And greetings to the language, the tribes, and the people of Aotearoa, New Zealand. And it's very significant that that we do things that way around. That we start with the wider community and the tribal community, and move from there towards the individuals. One of the things that I would want to stress is a wide construction of social constructionism itself. And my definition of social construction is that is very much influenced by Michel Foucault, and to a lesser extent by Gilles Deleuze and Guattari. What I came into in the beginning of the 80s and 90s was the original emphasis on mediation, because mediation seemed to be happening at the point that where languages, whether the people told and the stories that they told were influenced by the great anonymous murmur of dialogue. The greatest, and this is what Foucault talked about. That's a direct quote from him. One of the things that he talked about was the concept of discourse. And I don't think we can escape the language of discourse. What we can do is substitute other languages for ones that are current. But what has happened in the last 15, 20 years has been a move away from, well, not so much away from mediation, but in addition to mediation, a number of other conflict resolution tools have been developed, and they include conferencing, they include undercover teams, they include mediation as well. So what I think there has been is a burgeoning of the waters of social construction away from mediation or past mediation or be as well as mediation, with a number of other practices which are based on a similar theme, but which may be different because they are different. So just with that little bit of introduction, I wanted to stop at that point and ask Marie whether she has any questions that she wants to ask.
Okay, well, thank you, John. Can you hear me? I'm not sure.
I can.
I'm unmuted. Oh, good. Okay. Well, first of all, I want to say thanks for contributing to this section. I love your work. I've read your work for years, and it was just great to have you and Gerald Monk participate. Your work was truly groundbreaking in terms of narrative mediation, and I have a lot of awe and respect for you for what you've contributed. And your chapter is it's beautifully laid out because you really show those parallels between narrative theory and using Michael White's work, and how we could think about social constructionist ideas as well. So I really appreciate that. And I kind of wanted to zoom in on what you've offered, because you offered a nice step-by-step process after introducing us to some of the work, some of the theoretical work. Really appreciated that. But one thing that I really wondered if you could say a little bit more about is that you talk about, instead of taking an inside approach, where we're looking at people who might be in a conflicted situation as having problem kind of intrapsychic personalities that need to be revised. And, you know, a lot of the earlier work on conflict was about, you know, getting people to change their way of being in the world. Whereas you talk about how you're going to take an outside in approach when you're working in as a mediator. Could you say a bit more about that?
Sure. An inside out approach is, as you say, Marie, very focused on what is coming from the heart and the inside of people. And we think that a lot of that is part of the function of discourse, and that a lot of what is taken to be inside out is actually outside in. And so we have talked about our theory as being an outside-in type of theory. And by that we mean people take pieces of the discourse that surrounds them, the great anonymous murmur of discourse, as Foucault called it, to create the world in which they live. And it's an outside-in process because it is a taking up of discourse which they are surrounded by and live within, and people act upon what they make up as a result of that. So that's what I mean by outside-in approach. Does that answer what you're asking?
Yeah. So I'm thinking of a young child, maybe, that might need some kind of intervention because there's conflict within the family. So
yes.
if we could, and you know, often in earlier theories, we would try to fix that child because that was the problem. So in terms of discourse, then you could start thinking differently about where this problem actually resides. Is that?
Yeah, that's true. And when we have talked about mediation, we've talked about it as growing from the practices that are around the conflict within families. But we have we wrote a book, in fact, called Conflict. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the name of it now. Conflict stories, which are influential in people's lives, and those are not by chance. They are neither are they completely without limits. They happen because people cannot but borrow from the great anonymous murmur of discourse. If there's one thing that I would want to stress, it would be the function of discourse in people's lives. And by this I mean the language, the non-verbal discourse, and the there's Dawn's just written about to everybody about the content of our book, the title of it, which I've just forgotten for this moment. But people borrow from the great anonymous murmur of discourse in order to make up what they say about themselves, and about their families. When the things that they say about themselves and about their families is pathological or is pathologizing, then we would seek to introduce another way of thinking that is a different, which is more closer to what people would prefer, because there is a stage of conflict which people go through, which is what they would not prefer and what they would prefer. There's a message from Dawn saying the time is up.
Oh, I think we have another couple of minutes, or just maybe for one.
Okay.
Yeah, I just want to point out too that your book title and the link is now in the chat, so we're good.
Good, yeah.
Yeah. So just maybe then, just in closing, because this is another thing that I'm quite curious about what you have to say, and I know it runs through your work, is the distinction between hope versus wants. And maybe you could just say a few words.
Right. We found that it was more useful to ask what people hoped for than to ask what they wanted, because when they were asked what they wanted, they went very much they fell back on the story which was giving them a position within which to speak to other people. But when you ask about their hopes, and I'm hoping that David will speak about this a little bit as well. When you ask for their hopes, people found it's much easier to talk about than their wants, and their wants took them into the conflict. Their hopes included the other person, and we have made a distinction between those things too. Is that?
Yeah, and it seems like that talking about hope is much more generative than getting entrenched in wants.
That's right.
Yeah.
Because wants are more selfish, and hopes are more in keeping with what social constructionism is about.
All right. Great. Thanks so much, John. And now I think Dawn, where are we with our timing and our schedule? Have you got it in front of you?
We've got Celiane and Zare coming in to share about their chapter.
Great.
So good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, everyone. I'm happy to share with you and with Celiane about our chapter. I'm talking from São Paulo, from Brazil, and Celiane from Amsterdam. And before we start, I would like to say that I'm from the tribe of educators. I'm one of those people who look around and ask, what is going on in here? And our chapter is a bit about sustaining this curiosity. We wrote a chapter called Placemaking, Social Construction, and the Global South. And what we did was to call attention to the context of a specific region in Brazil, in the north of São Paulo state. And we are connecting the concepts of placemaking and community building with the epistemology of social constructionism. And the idea was to think like, as educators, I teach at a public federal university in Brazil. Celiane teaches at a university in the Netherlands. How can we design learning journeys and you get a concrete experience, a field trip? We brought many Dutch students combined with Brazilian students into this community in the north of São Paulo city. Together with the community, what happens when something like this happens? And this raised some reflections on how we relate community work with social constructionist practices. And I think that the result was quite intriguing and powerful. And I would like to say that placemaking, especially many people say like, what is placemaking? And we look at the concept of place, what is understood by place in opposition of space, simply said, considering identity, belonging, stories that this place has. And along with a local NGO in Peru, in this neighborhood, we brought our students to a series of experiences regarding trails. We visit some areas that are historical areas in Peru, and we started generating different kinds of knowledges, looking at epistemologies from the South. So we understand that in this region, there is so much of knowledge that would like our students to work along with the local community to help them and help themselves learn about what kind of tourism will benefit the most this community. Celiane.
Okay, thank you, Zari. Continuing with the chapter, working with this concept that Zari just shared with us, we wrote about this specific case experience that we went through with the students, with the communities, with the professors. And from there, we transform some of the experiences into principles. And we share the principles in this chapter. So I'm going to mention briefly these three principles. We're not going to have time to go too much in depth, but one principle we call build from what is available. So in these 2 weeks of experiences where I brought my students from the Netherlands with the students of Zari in this community of São Paulo, you can imagine that we had such a short time to work on an assignment, a collective assignment that we created. And then what we learned is instead of starting with the lack of resources, it's a poor community and they lack of many things. We started from, okay, what is available here? And let's focus on that and build from there. And also based on the work of Boaventura Santos, which is who is a professor from Portugal. And he talks about the plurality of epistemologies. So how the world needs the plurality of epistemologies, and mostly we are blinded epistemologically. So how can we use, and here I find so difficult in English to find a word because we have just knowledge In Portuguese, we have knowledge, which is conhecimento, the formal knowledge, but we also have saberes, which is the conhecimento that belongs to everyone and everywhere. So the idea is to combine these saberes, the academic saberes, the local saberes, the wisdom of the community, and build together, which is leads me to the second principle, which is learning by doing and creating by experimenting. This community has an NGO that works with active experimentations of places. They bring meanings to places. They transform spaces into places. And what they do in those poor communities, they have abandoned buildings, and they just take the abandoned building and they transform into some cultural space where the community can use it. And also they can invite visitors to come and to get to know their own history. And here, just quickly, this area is an area of indigenous people and also quilombolas, which is the descendants from the ex-slaves. So there's a lot of history there, and they want to bring visitors to see who they are, and also to demystify the ideas that the outskirts of São Paulo is always awful, violent, and poor and dangerous. And they want to complexify the story of their territories. And finally, the third one is collaborative practices to strengthen the community. They create the cultural identity of their community by bringing people together and by having these collaborative practices. And also by receiving us, and important to say here, we went there to visit, and they also placed us in their community. So we stay with local families because they wanted us to experience firsthand from within. And by having us there, relating with this other knowledge, saberes, and building together, it really, we could see that the community got stronger. And even calling the attention of those who do not participate yet into those activities, they start getting curious to see these poor neighborhoods being occupied by the university, by professors, by people from the city center, and it all causes some disruption and question, oh, maybe I'm worth it, maybe I want to participate in this big movement. So the transformations are happening in the process. So to close here, in this chapter, we want to show the developments of placemaking intervention from a constructionist perspective. And as Zari said, we are educators experimenting together to design new formats of education that can be more relational and collaborative and benefiting students and community. So that's how we are tapping into this plurality of knowledge. And we hope we can offer some insights about developing this kind of education, and also some insights to support other communities struggling with political, social, and economic matters to learn different ways of approach and reinventing themselves. So thank you. Thank you, Zari.
Thank you both. I really look forward to some conversation about placemaking. I'm David Anderson Hooker. I bring you greetings from what is currently described as South Bend, Indiana, but it is better understood as the occupied and unceded territory of the Miami and of the Potawatomi and of the Pokagon bands of indigenous people from this area who have used this area for education and cultural transmission for any number of centuries before they were first visited and then displaced by the people who currently have dominion over the governing practices in this area. So I bring you greetings, greetings to all my relatives. I just want to say that the transformative community conferencing process that I write about in my chapter is the emergence from a failure. I had been working with a group, descendants of former enslaved, former enslavers, and also traders and investors in the slave industrial complex in the United States, descendants of those groups in a dialogue process. And over the course of 3 years, had developed a manual, a framework for engagement. And the framework for engagement described narrative practices. I use the term narrative practices for history, healing, connection, and action. Facing history, making connections, healing our historical wounds, and taking action to address the injustices that have remained from those historical harms. And near the end of the time that I was finishing the manual to describe the history, healing, connection, and action narrative practices, I actually encountered John Winslade. And following the trail of John Winslade, I got back to Michel Foucault, to Michael White, to Gilles Deleuze, and to others, and realized that while I was saying narrative practices, what I actually meant were story practices. And there is a deep and rich distinction, because the narratives are what are carved out of, as John was describing earlier, the discourse. The narrative is that framing place in which people draw on to be able to tell their stories. And then what happens is, I think it's Vivian Burr who says that, knowledge is something that we do together. John says this, but also Peter Block describes the fact that communities and culture are just conformed to, or are the products of, the conversations that we have together. And so if those conversations that we have are shaped by narratives, and those narratives are generally uninvestigated, then what might be a methodology that we could use to allow people to unveil the narratives, and then to investigate and to choose, make a choice of a preferred narrative for a future. So the transformative community conferencing process uses the architecture of narrative mediation, the way that Winslade and Monk laid it out. And it builds on some of these other, the values of appreciative inquiry and restorative practices, but it's doing it at a collective level. So Eileen, you talked about the idea of removing or setting aside scripts. What we do in a transformative community conferencing process is actually to bring the scripts up front. If you have a community of people who have lived very different lives, even though they are geospecifically co-located, but the way that identity, class, race often are set up, at least in these failing to be United States, people end up living very different lives. And they live in very different quarters of their own location. And so bringing them together, and as a first round, inviting them to look at a play together or a movie together and try to discern what's the backstory, what's the script, what are the unspoken containers that are causing their action. So it's a unsophisticated externalizing process to begin looking at the movie together, because none of them have an investment in that. They didn't produce it, they didn't live it, or the play together. But then you invite them to imagine themselves as performing that community. Their community is a performance. And so inviting them to start asking, what are the background stories? What are the scripts? What are the narrative containers that you get seduced into by living in this community? So we start doing that externalizing practice of mapping the problematic and asking, what does this problematic produce? So people aren't the problem, John, the problem is the problem. How do we name the problematic together, and then start noticing and sharing stories? And so this is that, Celiane, Zara, this is what you all were talking about. The plurality of epistemologies gets shared in a story form once people start noticing how we are each interacting with the problem. In the presence of fear, separation, ignorance, and apathy, what are the things I get invited to do? What are the things that I get invited to not say? And people name those. But that's never, even when you have a dominant, even hegemonic narrative that constrains and produces precarity in people's lives, that's never the totality of their existence. And so you do the reverse mapping and invite, what else? What are the unique circumstances that are also existing that aren't predicted by this this predominant or problematic narrative. So this is following the architecture of traditional narrative mediation, but it's doing it at a collective level. So people start noticing that there are 2 or 3 narratives that are shaping their lives and experience. And then they have to always do what's necessary for transformation, which is to choose. I place a dominant narrative and a unique set of narratives in front of them and then ask them to choose which of these would be the preferable, which of these is the core of a preferred narrative of a future for you. And what we're doing in this way, which avoids some of the power-based problematics that are imposed in mediation practices. I'm a 40-year mediator, and so I know that often mediation, where you try to create a shared vision of a future or a shared understanding of history in order to craft an outcome, that often the sharing ends up being determined by power distribution. So we don't want to do a shared vision of a future. We want to craft what Byron Bland and Lee Ross at Stanford would describe as a vision of a shared future. Like, how are your hopes? How do they get manifest? What are the relationships, resources, structures? Who has to be extended testimonial authority in order for the hopes that you would prefer to come into place? And so that becomes the foundation for this community transformation. One of the things I'm really interested in this, that the place-based placemaking model may help us with, is the difference in temporality. So this is the place for the transition, because what I notice is people who are experiencing precarity and oppression at a deep level don't always have the time to stop and reflect and figure out new language. They experience an urgency where others in seeking to do social construction often give themselves the time, the luxury of time. And so I'm wondering what you all discovered, even between the professors and the students and those who were experiencing the deep and direct oppression. How were you managing those different temporal dimensions in your placemaking strategies?
Powerful question, David. Now that I hear your voice, I have the feeling that your voice touches us. You're kind of touching each other from far away. Well, we're talking about an area that suffers from a lot of injustice, and this generates anger. And I would like to ask you later about it, how you deal with anger. And your voice, when touching me, like brings a degree of satisfaction that is so amazing, that makes me feel connected with this move. What I would say regarding the time and temporality for these practices, I was quite impressed when we were in Quilombaki and we went to Jongo. Jongo is a kind of dance. And there, when you move your body, when you bring people aware of this instant, that there's something more powerful, you don't need to explain things. You feel with people. And for me, like, that was one of the most amazing experience. We are like with drums and with students, with locals, with professors, and suddenly the drums start and you are there and you might have 1001 reasons and theories why people would not have the time to connect or to reflect. And at the moment, you feel, I don't know, I'll bring Maturana, this Chilean philosopher, love into the table. And you just feel with them. And when you're connected with this intention, it seems that we can work from there with the emerging future that is appearing.
Can I add something quickly here?
Sure.
Yeah, I love you brought Jongo, Zaire, because I also thought of one of the occupied places that they got there. they transformed into a hip hop house. And they are experts in hip hop. And when we got there, instead of just put us in a space for the professors to talk and the European students to talk, they just invite us, let's get to know each other at the hip hop house, where they were giving us classes on how to dance hip hop. And in that moment, the invitation is turned around. And I think the way we are welcoming and what is the invitation provokes new narratives. And in placemaking, they play around also with the place. So the language is not just how we are framing questions, but where we are inviting the meetings to happen.
Yeah, and I think that, so this is Judith Butler's notion of performativity. And so place creates the space, and then within that space, the thing that you do is producing or is making something that probably didn't previously exist. And so even for those moments, the Django moments, you are experiencing community in a way where no one is more expert than another. And so all of the possibilities of hierarchy and dominion are taken away, right? Or possibly even reversed, because the people who are familiar with hip hop or Django are often likely in communities to not have that kind of power knowledge. They have a sabir, they have one wisdom of knowing that has to be honored and respected, as opposed to just the, how do you say the other, the konos, the konos?
Saberes.
Saberes, yeah. So how does it become sustainable? This is the thing. So the intention of transformative community conferencing was to create the grounding for transforming culture. And what I've come to understand is that culture is sustained by relationships, the distribution of the quality and the nature of relationships, the distribution of resources, the structures, and testimonial authority. And so I wonder who's listened to, who has sufficient testimonial authority. So I wonder, in a 2-day placemaking experience or activity, how do you begin to think about sustainability? What's the lasting that creates the narrative shift, so that people are actually operating inside of a different narrative frame and not just having stories about having been hosted by a group?
Difficult question. My guess, I think it's a long process, and I think one of the presenters talk about the need of time. I think time is fundamental, but there is a group of people in this NGO, Quilombaki, who started 15 years ago as youngsters in their 15, 16, and they built up from scratch. And now they run this NGO and they truly believe in the community. So they make sure everything that happens around is made by the community. So when anyone who visits, they stay within the communities. And the families, they even got a professional training on hospitality and how to host the visitors. They created their own restaurant. So they have the community cooking for the visitors. They have their own guides that bring us around and in the nature around there. So I think this believing their own capacity and really engaging and inviting their expertises around, their own saberes, I think slowly really creates this space of that become powerful and sustainable.
And I guess that all of us, we arrived over-prepared and under-structured. We were aware of this encounter, locals, students, professors. We've been reading the locals who received us at their houses. That was so powerful to stay at a poor community in a hill and talk with students and sleep at someone's bed. So there was a preparation for that. But we arrived suspending these voices of judgment, of cynicism, of fear, and allowing ourselves to be deeply transformed by a sense of presencing, this presence with sensing. That is like, wow, when the drums hit, man, you were there, or you were there.
Yeah.
And this is like hard to explain, even verbalize, but that's what we tried in our chapter somehow. And it's so beautiful that now they have like this, what they call resistance tourism. Tourism as a form of resistance.
I love that idea. I love that idea a lot. But I think that you're onto something by saying you can't language it, like, you know, not having the language for the experience, because in fact, what earlier speakers have said is that language is the container for discourse, and often those discourses are constraining, right? And so if you have to resort to, like Celiane, earlier you were trying to say, I can't find the language, to have to fit it into the language of a people or a knowledge system that doesn't affirm you, right? Then you have to find a different languaging in order to give permission to exist in a different way. And so I think it's exactly right that you all are struggling to find the languaging for this thing.
I don't know how we are with time, John.
I have no idea how we are with time, because we could just keep going for a long time.
I can give you another minute if you know, David, if you want to share one of your examples of how you find sustainability in your work, and then we can bring the others in for some Q&A.
Yeah. So just a really quick thing. For instance, working with police and members of the movement for Black Lives, Latin Kings and Queens in Greensboro, instead of having them ask about police community relations, because that's a horrible framing for transforming community. Ask, how do we create a space in which everyone feels safe, protected, and respected? When you name that question, people start naming that, what we notice is that there are relationships, resources, structures, and different people have to be given a level of testimonial authority in order for the culture to shift. And so you name that preferred narrative, identify these as the places in which we have to start building towards that preferred narrative of a future. And so that becomes the action agenda. But the narrative itself is something that becomes the point of accountability. If we have committed to this preferred narrative of a future, then I don't have to critique you when you do something that goes against it. People aren't the problem is the problem. I have to say, I can't see how your decision or action is in favor of the narrative of a preferred future that we have identified collectively. Help me to see that. So that invites us back into dialogue. That invites us back into equality. That invites us back into the commitment and the covenant that we've made, which over time sustains their actions in a variety of ways and allows them to both do independent work and collectively come back together to continue advancing a shared narrative of a preferred future that they have seen themselves in and heard how their stories and voice were equitable in the production of that narrative. So that's an approach to sustainability that is helpful, I think, over time.
Okay.
Beautiful.
So I'm gonna bring all the authors in, and feel free to be in dialogue with each other. Or Sheila, I've invited you to see if there's any questions coming into the chat. You can bring that into the conversation.
Dawn, I wanted to also just thank everybody for their presentations. This has been just fascinating, and I loved working with all of you a year and a half ago when you started writing your chapters, and this is just such a wonderful opportunity to have everybody together. There's a question that I think would be relevant to all of you that has been posed by David from South Africa, and it's this idea of trust. And I'm just wondering how, if any of you want to speak to that, how do you generate trust within a group when there's harm and healing that needs to take place.
I'm always willing to lean in first on the question of trust. I'm always with. So if you all don't, I'm glad to lean in. Trust is hard to build because people think of it as a unified concept, as a unitary existence. Trust is actually a bundle of, at minimum, 3 properties. There's trust willing, there's trust motivated, and then there's trustworthy, right? And so you don't build trust by just doing one thing. People have to be willing to trust. And so you extend the extent to which they're willing to trust, you only go that far. People have to be motivated by the fact that others have extended trust to them. And then you have to be trustworthy. Like, are you even able to do the thing that I'm expecting, or have I misplaced my trust? Should it be with someone else? Because if you're not trustworthy, if you're not capable of doing the thing to which I have my hopes attached, then I shouldn't feel bad about the fact that you didn't do it. It's just a misplace of trust. So we've got to find the alignment between willingness, motivation, and worthiness in order to build trust. And it's a small practice, step by step, of bringing that bundle together.
Thank you.
I'm just curious, David, as you're saying that, that feels to me in this context of what David is talking about from his experience in South Africa, where there's these deep wounds from apartheid, that this temporality question comes back again, like how much investment in relationship do we need to spend of dancing the jungle, of doing other things to shift the kind of relationship and power structures to build trust willingness, to build trustworthiness. It feels like there's a commitment, a real commitment for time and investment in the relationship. What do you think about that? Push back on me if you think you're going like,
yeah.
What do you think?
So relationality is often the illusion that is used to avoid justice and accountability and transformation. If we spend good time building relationship with folks, we often don't have to use any additional energy to transform. And we often use energy in relationships assuming that we are, in our current state, are fit for the world that we want. Most of us are not currently acting inside of the world that we want. So people, particularly people who experience privilege and have less precarity in a context, are willing to do the relationship piece. This is what I found in a lot of these other dialogue processes. They're willing to do the relationship piece, make the connections, but then they all drop out when it's time to take action because it's a cost. There's a cost, there's a loss associated with the transformation. And so I don't want relationality to overshadow the need for transformation, right? Let's be relational on the other side of a transformed and more just and equitable society.
So the investment really needs to take place of rebuilding, or not even rebuilding, but building that equity and transforming the harms, repairing the harms, and getting us to a place where actually as a society, there is the trustworthiness. There isn't trustworthiness until that happens.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That work has to happen so that we can be in a place of trustworthiness.
That's
collectively.
my sense of it. That's my sense of it.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much. We're needing to wrap up here. We're just about done with our time. I did put in the chat a link to the book and a 25% discount code for anybody that would like to go there and take a look at that book. And Maria, I'm going to turn it over to you for any final thoughts as the editor of this section.
Great, thank you. I just want to point out that there were 4 authors who couldn't attend today, and I really encourage you, when you purchase the book, to look at those chapters. There's a wonderful one on reimagining the welfare state, and that was written out of Denmark. There's another one in South America. There's another one here on the coast of British Columbia up north, one of the authors works with Indigenous communities there. So there's a lot of very interesting work. Dwayne Bidwell also sent his regrets. He's in transit right now, heading to Alaska. So lots of really valuable ideas, I think, to be able to do projects, international projects, to glean some ideas and some practical experiences of the authors. And I also just want to end, because this is our last session, I just want to end with just a hats off to Sheila, Emerson, and Celiane, and of course, Mary, for bringing this together. This is an unbelievable handbook. It's 60 chapters that cover a full range of therapeutic interventions, education, organizational change, community practices, and several more. So hats off to all of you. This is quite a feat, unbelievable in fact. So thank you so much.
Yeah. And I just want to thank all the authors today for sharing your work. Thank all the participants for coming into this conversation. This has been recorded. It will be available on our YouTube channel. We have a playlist for all of these 7 dialogues with the authors for the SAGE Handbook. So you're all welcome to go back into that and on our YouTube page and listen to all of these dialogues over the past 7 months. So again, thank you so much. And we will be signing off now. So yay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.